Hi, it's Chris Long speaking. I'm the president and CEO of Palmer Square. And we're often asked to really help people better understand the CLO structure. And I often believe, visually seeing it and having it be communicated is the best way to learn it. And so today's goal is really to start from scratch and really illustrate the benefits of what is the CLO structure. So, really, if you think about a CLO, it looks like any company in corporate America in that there are assets, there is debt, and there is equity. And this, as you know, is the structure of every company in America, with the concept that to buy assets, you need to be able to finance it. And how do you finance something? You can do it with debt that you raise. You can also put in equity capital. And so if you look at this structure, it's the age-old A equals D plus E. For the equity, think of this as the ownership of the company. That's how we like to describe it. This is the owner. Okay, so let's think about, what's the size of this company? Well, let's take an example of a $400 million CLO. So this is just one CLO. As you may know, the CLO space is approaching $600 billion in market value. So this is just a $400 million example. But let's look at that. So what does that mean? That means that there's $400 million of assets. This is kind of to generalize, but this will give you some of the idea of size. There is $360 million of debt, and there's $40 million of equity. Now, right away, what you should notice is the equity owner, that $40 million gets them $400 because they're using $360 million of debt. It looks very similar to a bank. So I'm going to break down now in each step, assets first, debt, and then the equity. And then I'll wrap it all back together with a summary on the CLO structure and how it's done over time. So starting with the assets. What does a CLO own? Well, I'm going to talk about the CLOs that Palmer Square issues, as well as the ones we invest in as a third party. So what is in the asset side of a CLO is broadly syndicated loans. And typically you'll have 200 to 300 different broadly syndicated loans in the asset pool. And broadly syndicated is defined as loans issued to companies that have sizes of, the loans that is, that have sizes of 350 million or more. Now at Palmer Square, we really like to concentrate really that 800 million or more, but for purposes of this discussion, broadly syndicated CLOs, it's really a 350 million or more threshold. Well, these 200 to 300 different loans that form the assets of the company have to be diverse by industry. They have to be diverse by issuer. There has to be so much that is US. There can only be so much that is Cov Light. And really, these restrictions are there to make sure, or at least to seek to have diversification. And it's been a big reason why CLOs have had so much success historically is these are corporate loans, and corporate loans have low correlations to each other at times. So for example, because maybe a loan in the retail space isn't doing so well, doesn't mean that a loan in the food and drug, aerospace, defense is not doing well. So there's that nice kind of give and take as far as diversification is concerned, which is really quite different than the mortgage space, where in the crisis, a subprime loan that is, for someone in borrower in Pennsylvania, and New York, and New Jersey, it all performed the same. That is not what happened in the last 2 credit pullbacks with CLOs, because that corporate diversification really mattered. So you have this corporate America exposure here because of these restrictions and this diversification. So that's really, really important. So those are your assets, okay? And now your assets generate interest. And let's say, for example, these assets are generating LIBOR plus 325 or 3.25%. Because the assets, that's your revenue, right? And what's the revenue of a loan? It's interest and then certainly principal when you get paid back. So that's the asset side. Well, this amount then gets paid to the debt holders. I'm drawing this arrow for a very specific reason, because this literally resembles the payment structure, which we refer to as a waterfall structure. So let's concentrate on this debt side now. We've covered the asset side. Let's talk about the debt side. The debt side is divided into different credit ratings. And the credit ratings are given not because there's AAA assets or AA assets or single A assets, but because the first one to get paid, the one at the top, given this waterfall structure, is the AAA. And because there's so much protection, such a minuscule probability of default, this person earns a AAA credit rating. Conversely, the one that's the last debt holder to get paid, BB, earns a high yield rating, which is very, very important to note. So if you look at the structure, each of these pay interest, but they pay it at slightly different levels. And this is completely illustrative, but to show you what this looks like, maybe the AAA gets paid LIBOR plus 115, and then the AA would be LIBOR plus 175, LIBOR plus 225, LIBOR plus 325, LIBOR plus 500. Each one of these offers a slightly additional amount of interest to take into account the risk. Now, what's notable about this debt is a big portion, in fact, 65% of the amount is AAA. AAA is the largest portion of the financing. And note, it's also the cheapest, and that's really, really important. So when you look at the debt, it's often done in the marketplace to look at what's called the weighted average cost of liabilities. So this is your weighted average spread over here, that's your revenue, and then what's your cost on the business? Your cost is paying back the debt holders. So you're looking at the weighted average cost of liabilities, which, this could come out to be LIBOR plus 160 or 1.6%. Again, completely illustrative, but on a blended basis, you can see that the AAA is a lot larger portion than certainly the BB is. Now, over time, this debt has performed incredibly well. If you look back, this market has been around since 1993. Moody's has rated over 7,200 different tranches. Over the course of that time, there's only been 53 impairments on the debt. And that's been principal impairments. There haven't been any interest impairments. So it's pretty remarkable. I mean, that's really akin to what the investment grade corporate, fixed rate corporate bond space has experienced from a default perspective. And maybe even more notable is 80% of those 53 were from CLOs issued 2003 or earlier. And that's notable because a lot of the things you can do in a CLO structure back then, you cannot do today. So there hasn't been a CLO default in a long, long time. Actually, the last registered one, I believe there were 3 in 2007. So it's a structure that is held up, has been time tested, and I think it's something that should draw investor attention. So back to the structure, you've got your assets, you've got your debt. Well, what is the equity doing? Well, the equity is the owner. They're the owner of the business. And the owner of the business gets the profit. And what's called, in our business, the excess spread. And the excess spread, or profit, is the difference between what your assets are generating revenue-wise, what your debt is costing you, and there's your return. Now, remember, it's 40 million getting you 400 million in assets. There's a 10 times multiplier effect to this spread, which is very important. So historically, you've seen CLO equity return north of 15% cash-on-cash returns. It's been a very profitable source of attribution for many, many fund managers, such as Palmer Square, that have a specialty and expertise in CLOs. So here's our structure. Well, what's the life cycle of it all? How long does it last? For what's called reinvestment style CLO, and stay with me here because I want to make sure you heard that, reinvestment style CLO, typical life is about 6 to 9 years. So how does it work? How do you get to 6 to 9 years? Well, this first 4 years, if you issued a CLO, let's say in, let's just say 2019, and let's use a 5-year reinvestment period, not a 4-year. We'll use a 5-year, which has been more frequent recently. Between 2019 and 2024, you have what's called the reinvestment period. And what that means is you're able to, you being Palmer Square or another, obviously a highly sought after manager, you're able to reinvest the asset side of the portfolio. Why is that important? Well, the equity investor doesn't want cash to sit in here, right? They want this to be fully invested, so it's generating this revenue, or what's called, again, weighted average spread. And if you think about the bank loan space, there's prepayments every year. And prepayment speeds can range from 5% to as high as 50%. And what is a prepayment? It's basically, for a bank loan, similar to a home mortgage, you can prepay at any time. Well, usually there's a 6-month period where you can, but just for generalization purposes, essentially you can always prepay a bank loan. Well, for a CLO, the owner doesn't want to sit on cash, so this reinvestment period allows you to buy a new loan with that cash. The reinvestment period also allows you to trade the portfolio to what's called build par, or make more money, in that you can do a swap. There's something that you want to own, you sell one thing, buy another. You can sell something for credit risk purposes because you think it's going to deteriorate and buy another loan. Now, it is subject to certain tests as the CLO seasons, but the point is you've got this 5 years to reinvest. And the hope is you do that in a period of volatility where you can sell things at one price and obviously buy things at a lower price and generate more profit that goes here. And we've had a lot of success at Palmer Square in doing what's called par build, basically building your asset size to a larger level. So you're done with the 5 years. What happens? Now the CLO starts to effectively wind down. So to generalize, for the first 5 years, everybody here was just getting interest. They were getting LIBOR 115, LIBOR 175, LIBOR 225, and so on. After the reinvestment period, there's no ability to take cash or trade. And again, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but the point is, after that period, you start to pay principal back. So like a bond, you have that interest for a while, and now they're getting principal back. Well, once you pay off, and this is a Palmer Square estimate, and we really think it's a useful rule of thumb, once you pay off about 60 to 65% of this debt, and this debt being the AAA amount, you really want to call the deal, because the profit going here goes down. Why does it go down? Well, you're paying back your cheapest financing, so this number is going up, which is causing this to go down, so you're not making as much of a spread, and you really want to think about taking your capital and doing something else with it. Well, what happens when this call occurs? Well, the person that owns, like any business in corporate America, the person that owns more than 50% of this has the ability to call the transaction. And what they do is they'll issue an optional redemption notice where they will begin selling the asset pool to pay everybody back at par. And CLOs have had major success paying everybody back at par. I think it's a very important consideration. Again, back to defaults. There's been very few, 53 total over the history of the market. So CLOs have paid back at par. Very, very important. Well, after you pay these back at par, there is a leftover amount for the equity holder, because the equity holder was able to get all of this profit, but now there's more assets than debt. So whatever's the residual, this person also gets. And that's where I get to that IRR, where you have that cash flow over time, and then at the end, you have additional cash flow, and that's been a high IRR, which I mentioned, sort of 15% plus. I'm gonna stop there. That is the first video on the structure of the CLO.